They always said a house isn't just bricks and walls, it's where trust lives. But I learned too late that trust can be mortgaged, sold, and signed away without your name on the paper. The night they told me the house was gone, I didn't even understand at first. My father-in-law sat at the dining table, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, flipping through a folder like it was nothing more than paperwork. My mother-in-law stood behind him, arms crossed, face unreadable. I remember the smell of her jasmine perfume, the same one she wore the day we moved in. It used to comfort me. That night, it made my stomach turn. They spoke with the kind of calm that comes from being practiced at it, from having already rehearsed what they'd say. The sale's gone through, Robert said, eyes still on the papers. We'll be moving out by the end of the month. I blinked, the words slow to register. The sale? I repeated. What sale? Margaret sighed, that clipped, polite sigh of hers. The house, dear. It's been sold. We accepted an offer last week. The room tilted. But, this is our home. Her tone softened, the way you speak to a child who just doesn't get it. It was our home, darling. Your father-in-law and I made the decision together. You and Daniel can find something smaller now that you're starting your own family. I looked at Daniel then, my husband, expecting him to say something, anything. But he just stared at the table, jaw clenched, silent. That was the moment I knew. He'd known all along. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. My heart felt like it had forgotten how to beat right. I thought about the mornings I spent cleaning this kitchen, the nights we laughed over dinner, the garden I planted with my own hands. Every corner of that house had a piece of me, and none of it was mine. I whispered, "You promised." Robert looked up finally, his face lined with something between guilt and irritation. "It was never legally yours, Anna. We gave you a place to stay, not ownership." Margaret added, "You should be grateful we helped you when you had nothing." Grateful. That word landed harder than any slap. When I first moved in with them, I thought it was love that opened their doors to me. Daniel and I had been married for just a year. We were still paying off the small wedding loan and trying to save for a place of our own. When his parents offered that we move into the family house, just until you two get settled, it felt like grace. The house was old but beautiful, a 2-story brick home on the edge of town, with a wide veranda and climbing roses that caught the morning light. It had belonged to Robert's father before him. Margaret said, "You can have the upstairs rooms. We'll make it work like one big family." And I believed her. The first few months were easy. I cooked dinners, she baked bread. Robert spent mornings reading the paper in his armchair. Daniel worked long hours at the hardware store, and I started teaching part-time at the local elementary school. On Sundays, we'd have breakfast together in the sunroom. Margaret liked to talk about the family legacy, how this house had seen 3 generations grow. One day, she told me once, "It'll all be yours and Daniel's to take care of. You'll raise your children here, make it even more beautiful." I remember smiling at that. Because it wasn't just a house to me. It was belonging. We weren't rich, but we were content. I'd spent years growing up in small rented flats with my mother, places that never truly felt like ours. There was always a landlord, always a notice taped to the door about rent hikes or repairs. When I first unpacked boxes in that house, I thought I'd finally stopped moving. I threw myself into making it a home. Fresh curtains in the upstairs bedroom. Lavender oil on the pillows. A herb garden in the back. Margaret noticed, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with that careful look of possession, like she was watching a tenant improve her property. Still, she never complained aloud. Not at first. "Anna, you do make the place look lovely," she'd say, sipping her tea. "It's good to see a young woman who still believes in taking care of a home." But then came the small corrections. "You don't need to prune that rose bush, it's older than you. You might want to check with Robert before changing the curtains." And once, after I'd painted the kitchen a soft blue. I would have preferred cream, but I suppose it'll do. I told myself it was harmless. I was living in their house, after all. But then, Why had she called it ours? About a year in, Daniel and I started contributing to the bills: electricity, water, groceries. Then, when Robert mentioned the mortgage payments, we added what we could. It's only fair, he said. You're living here too. I agreed. It made sense. Family or not, it was right to share. When Daniel's promotion came through that year, we offered to increase our share. We even helped pay for the roof repairs after a storm. Robert had clapped Daniel on the shoulder and said, "You're a good son. This house will always be your home." That phrase, "this house will always be your home," became a kind of anchor. When I planted bulbs in the front yard, I imagined our children running there one day. When I scrubbed floors late at night after grading papers, I thought, I'm building something that will last. It was an unspoken agreement. We were investing not in rent, but in roots. It started subtly. Margaret grew colder, more precise in her language. Instead of our home, she began saying the house. Instead of our plans, she said your stay. I noticed, but I didn't confront her. She was Daniel's mother, and I didn't want tension. Then came the first sign I couldn't ignore, a letter. It arrived one afternoon addressed to R. and M. Collins. The envelope bore the logo of a real estate firm. I remember holding it in my hands, staring at the return address. When I mentioned it to Margaret later, she brushed it off. Just some valuations, she said. Routine property updates. But the next week, a man in a suit came by to inspect the structure. And another week later, I overheard Margaret on the phone. "Yes, we're open to offers. We just want to make sure the transition's smooth." Transition. My gut told me something was wrong, but when I asked Daniel, he hesitated. "She's probably just getting the place appraised," he said. "You know Mum always planning ahead." He sounded reassuring. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine. That summer, Margaret organized a family dinner, one of those just us gatherings that felt more like ceremonies. The table was set with her best china. Robert opened a bottle of wine that had been gathering dust since the 90s. They spoke mostly to Daniel about business, savings, the future. Whenever I joined in, they smiled politely, then pivoted back to him. At one point, Robert raised a toast. To family. And to new beginnings. I didn't understand the meaning then. But I remember the way Margaret looked at me across the table, not unkind, but final. Like she'd already decided something I hadn't been told. That night, Daniel was quiet. When I asked if something was wrong, he said, "Just tired." But when he thought I was asleep, I heard him in the hallway, whispering into his phone. "Yes, I'll handle it. She doesn't need to know yet." A week later, I found a folder in the study while looking for spare envelopes. It wasn't labeled, but inside were printouts of property listings and one familiar address, ours. The description read, "Charming heritage home with dual occupancy potential." My stomach dropped. Dual occupancy. That was us. When I confronted Daniel, he froze. "Anna," he began, his voice measured, "Mum and Dad have been talking about downsizing. They thought maybe." "Maybe what?" I interrupted. "That we'd just move out. After everything we've put into this place." "They're not kicking us out," he said quickly. "It's just, look, the market's good right now. They're trying to secure their retirement." "And what about our security?" I asked. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You're overreacting. Nothing's decided." But he was wrong. It had already been decided. Just not by me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in darkness, the creak of floorboards under my feet, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of jasmine drifting through the open window. Everything around me whispered permanence. And yet, somehow, it was all slipping through my hands. In the living room, the ledger I kept for bills and contributions sat open. I ran my fingers down the list, every payment, every repair. All the proof of how much we'd given. I whispered to the silence, "You can't sell what we built." But I was wrong. They could. And they did. It was a Thursday evening when Margaret called us all into the dining room. She stood by the window, the sunset spilling gold light over her shoulder. Robert sat at the table, his expression calm, almost rehearsed. Daniel already looked defeated. Margaret spoke first. We accepted an offer on the house. I remember staring at her, waiting for the rest, the reassurance, the plan. None came. You can't be serious, I whispered. You didn't even talk to us. Robert adjusted his glasses. It wasn't our responsibility to. The property belongs to us. But we've been paying. He cut me off gently but firmly. Contributing. Not investing. There's a difference. Margaret's tone softened. You'll find your own place soon, Anna. It'll be good for you and Daniel to have independence. I wanted to scream. Independence. From what? From the dream they built around me and then sold off piece by piece. But I stayed still. My voice came out small, strangled. You promised this would be our home. Margaret gave a little sigh. Promises change, dear. Circumstances change. That night, Daniel tried to explain, to reason, to soften it. But I could barely hear him. Every word felt like a betrayal dressed in logic. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint shadows of the roses outside swaying in the moonlight. The house felt different now, like it had already stopped belonging to me. And somewhere deep down, I decided that if they could rewrite the story, so could I. The next morning, Margaret acted like nothing had happened. She was already in the kitchen when I came down, humming softly, spreading marmalade on toast as sunlight filtered through the lace curtains. The same woman who had erased my home overnight now smiled at me like we were sharing another ordinary morning. Tea? She asked pleasantly. Her tone was too bright, too rehearsed. I sat opposite her without answering. My chest felt hollow, like something vital had been scooped out. The chair beneath me might as well have been ice. She slid a cup toward me anyway. You'll feel better once things settle down. I wanted to ask, when exactly does one feel better after being betrayed? But I just nodded weakly. My voice didn't trust me yet. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his hair still damp from the shower. He kissed his mother on the cheek, a gesture that used to warm me, and poured himself coffee without looking at me. They talked about errands, groceries, the weather, the way people do when pretending life is normal. Finally, I spoke. When are we leaving? Silence. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Daniel cleared his throat. End of the month, I think. Margaret added, we'll all move out together. The buyers want a quick settlement. All. Together. The word hit me like a cruel joke. They had lumped me in with their plans, the daughter-in-law turned squatter. Later, in the garden, I tried to find peace in the small things, the rosemary bushes, the soft soil under my hands, the sound of sparrows nesting near the fence. But everything felt different now. Even the earth seemed to reject me. When I looked up at the window, Margaret was watching me from inside. Not with hostility, but with something colder, detachment. Like she was already measuring how long until I'd be gone. The following days blurred together. Margaret and Robert were busy with calls and appointments. Strangers came and went, inspecting walls, measuring rooms, asking questions about plumbing. I overheard one of them say, they're lucky they got this offer so fast, the market's turning. I wanted to tell him it wasn't luck. It was theft wrapped in family. Daniel avoided confrontation, throwing himself into work. When he was home, he'd say, I just need time to process this, Anna. As if he hadn't been processing it for months before telling me. At night, I'd lie awake, listening to them whisper downstairs. Doors opening and closing softly. The faint smell of Margaret's perfume whenever she passed by my door. The scent had once reminded me of warmth. Now it smelled like deceit. I tried to hold on to routine. Teaching, laundry, tending the herbs. But even my classroom felt distant, the laughter of children like a language I couldn't speak anymore. When I returned home one evening, the for sale sign had been taken down. It was official. It was raining the day I stumbled across the folder again, the one I'd seen weeks earlier in the study. This time, it wasn't hidden. It sat on the desk, slightly ajar, a corner of paper sticking out. I hesitated, heart pounding. My conscience whispered, "Don't." But my instinct, the one that had been ignored too long, said, "Look." Inside were property documents, loan agreements, and signatures. 2 names printed at the bottom of one form caught my eye, R. Collins and D. Collins. No A. Collins. No Anna. It was a joint sale agreement. They had listed Daniel as co-owner, something that, legally, wasn't even true. They'd made him a placeholder for family continuity. The good son keeping it all in the bloodline. The betrayal suddenly had layers. Not just the house, but trust itself. I confronted Daniel that night. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, pretending to read. "Why is your name on the sale contract?" I asked. He froze. The faint glow of the screen lit his face, and for the first time, I saw the shame in it. He sighed. Mum and Dad wanted things to move smoothly. The buyers preferred having it under family names. It was easier that way. Easier. My voice cracked. Easier to erase me? It's not like that, he insisted. You're my wife, Anna. It's our life. This doesn't change that. Then why didn't you tell me? He hesitated. Because I knew how you'd react. There it was, the coward's excuse disguised as care. I stood there, every word he didn't say louder than the ones he did. Daniel, do you even hear yourself? You've known for months they were selling. You helped them. He looked away. I didn't want to choose sides. You already did, I said softly. Over the next week, I watched as they packed. Margaret was meticulous, labeling boxes with cursive handwriting, sealing them with perfect tape lines. I wasn't sure where I fit into any of it. Every time I tried to start packing my things, Margaret would appear at the doorway. "Oh, don't worry about that room yet," she'd say. Or, "We'll sort what belongs to whom later." It was as if she was reclassifying the house, item by item, deciding what memories stayed with them and what I was allowed to keep. One afternoon, I found her sorting through the kitchen drawers. She was wrapping the old silver cutlery in tissue paper. The same set she'd told me years ago, "One day this will be yours." I watched her for a moment before speaking. "Are you taking those?" She didn't look up. "They were my mother's." "But you said." "I changed my mind," she said simply, slipping the last spoon into the box. That night, I sat in the garden under the porch light, rain pattering softly on the roof. My hands were covered in soil. I'd been digging up the rosemary bushes, the ones I'd planted. If they could take the walls, I'd take the roots. Anything, that was mine. Daniel came outside, watching me quietly for a long moment. "Anna," he said finally, "you don't have to do this." I looked up. "Don't I? It's just a house." I laughed. The sound came out hollow. "No, Daniel. It was our life." By the time the movers came, I'd packed only what truly mattered: my books, my teaching journals, a few family photos, and the box of documents I'd copied from the study. I didn't know what I was looking for yet. Only that I needed evidence, not to punish, but to remember the truth when they'd all try to rewrite it. Margaret and Robert moved into a smaller house near the coast. Daniel and I found a rental apartment, cold, beige, impersonal. He said it was temporary, but his tone carried no conviction. The first night there, I couldn't sleep. The air felt foreign, the silence heavy. I turned to him and whispered, "Do you even miss it?" He said nothing. And that silence told me everything. Weeks passed. I tried to move on, but grief doesn't vanish when the boxes are unpacked. It lingers in the color of curtains, in the smell of old wood, in the ache behind your ribs. One Saturday, as I went through the documents I'd saved, something caught my attention. A line in an old loan statement, an account number I didn't recognize. It appeared several times, tied to payments made by Daniel's parents after the sale. But they weren't paying the bank. They were paying a private account. My curiosity turned to unease. The transactions were labeled interim holding transfer, small sums, recurring monthly. If they'd sold the house, why were they still paying anyone? I decided to find out. I called the real estate agency listed on the contract. A polite receptionist transferred me to the agent who'd handled the sale, a man named Mr. Hanley. When I introduced myself, there was a pause on the line. "Oh, Mrs. Collins. I wasn't expecting to hear from you." His hesitation confirmed what I already suspected. "I just had some questions," I said evenly. "I noticed payments going out from my in-laws' account. I wanted to understand what they were for." He hesitated again. "I'm not sure I can disclose." "I'm on the contract," I lied. "I'm Daniel Collins's wife. You can consider this joint inquiry." There was a shuffling sound, paper, maybe. Then a sigh. "They arranged a private buyback clause," he said finally. "It's not unusual." My grip on the phone tightened. "A buyback clause?" "Yes. Your in-laws requested an option to repurchase the property after 2 years at a fixed rate, provided certain conditions are met. They're essentially leasing it out for now." I froze. Leasing. Not selling. So, they still own it. Technically, yes. Partial equity. The sale was structured more as a financial repositioning. In simpler words, it wasn't gone. They'd never truly given it up. They'd just moved it out of reach from me. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in stunned silence. Every conversation replayed in my head: Margaret's tone, Robert's calm, Daniel's avoidance. They hadn't sold our home to retire. They'd sold it to secure theirs. And in doing so, they'd erased my name completely while keeping their own future intact. When Daniel came home that evening, I was waiting with the folder open on the table. "Tell me the truth," I said quietly. He froze. "About what?" "About the buyback clause. About how your parents still own the house." His face paled. "How do you know that?" "So it's true." He sank into a chair, running his hands over his face. "Anna, it's complicated." "No," I said, voice trembling, "it's not complicated. It's cruel." He looked up, eyes red. "They were scared, okay? The economy's been rough. They didn't want to lose their legacy. And I wasn't part of that legacy." He swallowed hard. "Mum thought you'd never understand." "She was right," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't." He reached for my hand. I pulled away. "You could have told me," I whispered. "You could have warned me, defended me, anything." His silence was heavier than words. In that moment, I realized I'd been fighting for something he'd never tried to keep. That night, I packed a small bag, not out of fury, but clarity. I needed distance. Not forever, but enough to breathe. I left a note on the kitchen counter. "I'm not leaving you. I'm leaving the lie." Then I drove to my sister's place an hour away. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless. With every mile, the weight in my chest loosened just enough to let air in. When I finally parked outside her house, I sat for a long time, engine ticking softly, before whispering to the night, "You can't sell my dignity." And for the first time, I almost believed it. It's strange how quiet clarity can be. After the noise of confrontation, the shouting that never quite came, silence feels louder than thunder. At my sister's house, the mornings were different. Softer. The sound of her kettle whistling, the smell of toast, the faint laughter of her children in the next room. But even surrounded by warmth, I couldn't stop seeing that house, our house, in my mind. The kitchen tiles I'd chosen, the garden where I'd planted rosemary. Every detail was a ghost, hovering at the edges of thought. I kept thinking, they didn't just sell the walls. They sold my story. My sister, Ruth, was a practical woman, 10 years older, always grounded. She didn't ask many questions that first day. She just let me sit there, wrapped in her oversized cardigan, sipping tea until I could speak. Finally, I told her everything, the sale, the clause, Daniel's silence. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said simply, "That's fraud, Anna. At least morally, if not legally." "I don't want revenge," I said, my voice small. "I just want the truth written somewhere that can't be erased." Ruth smiled faintly. "Then start writing." She slid a small notebook across the table, her way of saying, "Document everything." Over the next few days, I filled that notebook with details, payment dates, receipts, property records, conversations I remembered word for word. Every page was a reconstruction of trust, line by line, number by number. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet. But collecting the truth made me feel less powerless. One afternoon, while I was at the grocery store with Ruth, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "Anna," he said quietly, "where are you?" "At my sister's," I replied. He exhaled. "I'm sorry." I almost laughed. "For what part? The lie, the silence, or the sale?" "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was trying to protect everyone." "By excluding me?" I asked softly. He hesitated. "You wouldn't have agreed." "You're right," I said. "I wouldn't have agreed to betray myself." He went silent. Then, almost pleading, "Come home. Please." I paused. "Home? Daniel, you sold home." I hung up before he could answer. That night, Ruth sat beside me at her kitchen table, flipping through the copies of the property documents I'd made. Her brow furrowed. "Anna, these aren't standard sale papers." "What do you mean?" She pointed at one clause near the bottom. "Here, conditional lease-to-own structure, contingent on internal transferee compliance." I frowned. "Internal transferee?" "It means," Ruth said slowly, "the house wasn't sold to strangers. It was transferred within their own network." I blinked. "Their network?" Ruth nodded. "They sold it to a family trust. Probably still managed under your in-law's name." My stomach dropped. "So they never sold it outside the family?" "Exactly. They just moved it, legally and financially, to keep control. You were the only one cut out." It hit me then, all those years of shared bills, home repairs, family talk about legacy. They'd used my effort to strengthen their own assets. They'd dressed exploitation up as generosity. I needed proof. The next day, I went to the local land registry office, a grey building that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. A polite clerk helped me search for the property record. After a few keystrokes, she looked up at me. Yes, 48, Rosewood Lane. Ownership transferred 3 months ago to the Collins Family Trust." I swallowed. "Is there any way to see who manages that trust?" She nodded, sliding a printed form across the desk. "Registered trustee, Margaret L. Collins." Of course. Even in absence, she had her signature on everything. I stared at that line until the ink blurred. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a calculated act, deliberate, precise. They hadn't just sold the home. They'd sold me out. I drove back that afternoon, not to Daniel, not to reconcile, but to face the woman who'd taught me that family could be a transaction. Margaret answered the door in her usual perfection, hair pinned neatly, pearls at her throat, a silk blouse the color of pale lilac. Her expression didn't falter when she saw me. "Anna," she said coolly, "you should have called." "I found the property transfer," I said, stepping past her into the hall. "The trust." Her eyes flickered, the briefest crack. "I see. You said you sold the house. But you didn't, did you? You just moved it under your name." "It was for safekeeping," she said softly. "Robert and I needed to ensure it stayed in the family." "I am family," I snapped. "By marriage," she corrected, calm as glass. "That's different." For a second, the room swayed. Her tone was so gentle, it almost disguised the cruelty. But I heard it. I felt it. "Do you even hear yourself?" I whispered. "You talk about legacy, But you erased the person who helped build it. Margaret sighed. You've always been idealistic, Anna. You see everything as moral when life is simply practical. I stared at her, this woman who had turned practicality into betrayal. You taught me one thing, I said quietly. When people show you what they value, believe them. And I walked out. A week later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Roberts. Inside was a short letter. Anna. I know things have gone too far. Margaret only wanted to protect what she built. It was never personal. I hope one day you can understand that we meant well in our own way. You have every right to feel wronged. But please remember that resentment burns the hand that holds it. Let this go. Robert. There was no apology, just a sermon. The kind that tells you to forgive before the sinner even says sorry. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. It wasn't worth tearing up. Some things deserved to stay whole, just to remind you how empty they were. 2 nights later, Daniel showed up at Ruth's house. He looked exhausted, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, like a man running from something he couldn't outrun. Can we talk? He asked quietly. Ruth shot me a look but nodded, leaving us in the kitchen. I poured him tea out of habit, even though my hands were shaking. He sat down, eyes on the mug. You were right. About the trust. About everything. I waited. I didn't know they'd go that far, he said. Mum told me it was just a financial restructure. She said it was temporary. And you believed her? I asked. He looked up then, his voice small. She's my mother. She's your mother, I said softly, but I was your wife. And you chose silence. He flinched. I didn't know how to stop it. I thought if I just stayed quiet, it would all settle. Betrayal doesn't settle, Daniel. It rots. He closed his eyes, tears glistening. I'm sorry. I know, I said. But sorry doesn't rebuild walls. He reached across the table. What do you want me to do? For the first time, I had an answer. Nothing, I said. I'll do it myself. In the weeks that followed, I met with a property solicitor, an older woman named Helen who spoke plainly and smiled rarely. After reading through the documents, she looked at me and said, "You won't get the house back. But you can challenge the structure of their trust if you prove contributions and intent." Contributions I can prove, I said, sliding over my folder of receipts and bank transfers. Intent too, they promised us a shared home. Helen nodded slowly. That'll help. But these cases take time, and they get personal. I smiled faintly. It's already personal. The day they received the legal notice, Margaret called me. Her voice was calm, but the sharpness beneath it was unmistakable. I thought you were better than this, she said. Fighting your own family? I'm not fighting family, I replied. I'm fighting deceit. You'll lose. Maybe, I said. But at least I'll lose honestly. She hung up without another word. Word spread quickly through the small town. People whispered at the market, at church, even in the staff room where I taught. Did you hear about the Collins family dispute? She's suing her in-laws, poor thing. Imagine turning against your husband's parents like that. I became the villain in someone else's gossip. But strangely, I didn't mind. Because for once, I knew my own story. While preparing evidence, Helen asked if I had any written proof of intent, promises, letters, anything. That night, I searched through my old boxes, looking for even a scrap of something. And then I found it, a Christmas card from Margaret, written the first year I moved in. To Anna, for all the love and work you've poured into this home. You've made it brighter, warmer, and truly ours. Love, Margaret. Truly ours. That one word ours might not mean much to anyone else. But to me, it was everything. It was acknowledgement. It was evidence. I brought it to Helen the next day. She smiled for the first time. Sometimes, she said, the smallest words carry the most weight. The case would take months, maybe years. I didn't know what the outcome would be. But somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't fighting for property anymore. I was fighting for the principle that kindness doesn't mean submission, that gratitude doesn't erase fairness, and that dignity, once sold, can still be reclaimed. The letter of intent had been sent, the silence had been broken, and there was no turning back. I didn't realize how exhausting justice could feel, not the big, dramatic kind with gavel strikes and tears, but the small, quiet kind that moves through paperwork, statements, and the slow grind of truth trying to be heard. Every week brought another letter, another form to sign, another reminder that I was challenging something sacred, family. Not everyone called it bravery. Most called it betrayal. In a small town, news doesn't spread. It seeps. I could feel it in the way people at the grocery store paused their chatter when I walked past. The way the woman at the bakery, who used to slip me extra rolls with a wink, now offered me exact change without looking me in the eye. At school, even my colleagues treaded carefully around me. One of them, Miriam, tried to comfort me one afternoon. "People just don't understand yet," she said gently. I smiled faintly. "They don't have to." "I do." But it still hurt. The part of me that once believed in family loyalty was learning how easily people weaponize that word when it protects the wrong side. Daniel and I were separated in every way but legally. He still lived in the apartment we'd rented after leaving the house. Sometimes he called. Sometimes he didn't. When he did, it was mostly about formalities, the solicitor, the papers, the logistics. One evening, he showed up at Ruth's door unannounced. He looked thinner, paler, like the weight of everyone's judgment was pressing on him too. "I told them you wouldn't stop," he said quietly. "I warned them." I stared at him. "Warned them about what?" "That I'd refuse to disappear." He sighed. "You've turned this into something bigger than it is." I laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. "Bigger?" "They stole our home, Daniel. They lied to me, to us. How small should I make that for your comfort?" He rubbed his temples. "They're old. They won't survive a court battle. Can't you just let it go?" There it was again, that phrase. The family mantra for silence. "Do you know what letting it go really means?" I asked softly. "It means pretending something wrong is normal. I can't do that anymore." Helen, my solicitor, was methodical. She gathered everything I had, bank transfers, utility receipts, written messages, the Christmas card. Each detail became a thread she wove into something coherent, a case built not on revenge, but recognition. The Collins Trust was established under the assumption of full family consent, she explained during one of our meetings. "You were never informed, which violates the basic principle of equitable contribution. That gives us ground to argue for reimbursement or partial ownership." She paused, then added carefully, "But they'll fight this with everything they have." I smiled faintly. "So will I." It didn't take long for the first counternotice to arrive. Neatly typed, 4 pages long, signed in Margaret's flawless penmanship. It began with "We regret that Anna has chosen to interpret generosity as obligation." Every line that followed painted me as ungrateful, unstable, and overly emotional. She claimed my contributions were voluntary acts of goodwill, not binding agreements. She even attached photographs of family dinners, holiday cards, to frame it all as love, not liability. It was strategic. Ruth called it manipulative genius. I called it cruelty disguised as civility. Our solicitors arranged a mediation session before things escalated to court. It was meant to be neutral, a table, a moderator, a chance for resolution. When I arrived, Margaret and Robert were already seated. Robert looked older, his skin ashen, his hands trembling slightly. Margaret, however, was impeccable as ever. She greeted me with a measured smile. "Anna." "Margaret." The mediator, a grey-haired man with kind eyes, began with pleasantries about communication and closure. But it all blurred into background noise. Margaret's words were what cut through. We only wanted to protect what's ours, she said calmly. You misunderstand the meaning of family. I leaned forward. No, I finally understand it. Family isn't ownership. It's trust. And you sold both. Robert shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't meant to hurt you. I turned to him, voice soft but steady. It did. And you knew it would. The mediator tried to steer us back, but Margaret's composure began to crack. You think you're the victim here, she said sharply. You were given everything, a roof, a name, a place in our home. And this is how you repay us? By telling the truth? I asked. Then yes. That's exactly how. Her lips trembled, and for the first time, I saw something unfamiliar in her eyes, not guilt, but fear. Because she realized I wasn't backing down. A week later, Helen called me into her office. They've offered a settlement, she said. My heart skipped. What kind? They're willing to transfer a financial sum equivalent to your contributions, plus interest. In return, you drop the case and sign a confidentiality agreement. I stared at her. Silence in exchange for closure. Helen nodded. Essentially. For a long time, I said nothing. The logical part of me knew it was fair. But the moral part, the part my mother raised, rebelled. I finally asked, if I sign it, does the truth disappear? Helen hesitated. Legally, yes. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. Then I can't. She gave a small, knowing nod. I thought you'd say that. That night, Daniel came to see me again. This time, he was angry, not the yelling kind, but the brittle, desperate kind that trembles under control. Do you know what you're doing? He asked, pacing the kitchen. You're tearing the family apart. I stared at him. No, Daniel. They did that the moment they decided truth didn't include me. He slammed his hand on the counter. It's just a house. It was never just a house, I snapped. It was everything we built together, every promise, every plan. They took that, and you watched. His shoulders slumped. You're going to make everyone hate you. I smiled sadly. They already do. He looked at me for a long moment, then whispered, I don't. I believed him. But love wasn't enough to rebuild what silence had broken. Months later, we stood in the small-town courthouse. It wasn't dramatic, no packed gallery, no shouting lawyers. Just paperwork, statements, quiet tension. Helen presented our case with the calm precision of someone who believed in facts more than theatrics. She laid out every receipt, every message, every promise. She even quoted Margaret's Christmas card, the word ours echoing through the courtroom like a confession. When it was Margaret's turn, she spoke with practiced grace. We never intended harm, she said. But one cannot claim ownership through kindness. Her words were elegant, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. For the first time, I saw the cost of deceit, not just on me, but on her too. The judge didn't make an immediate ruling. He said he'd review the evidence and deliver his verdict in a few weeks. But as we all stood to leave, he added quietly, in matters like these, equity often favors honesty over inheritance. And that was enough. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled like rain. Reporters weren't waiting, no one in town cared enough to make it news. But to me, it felt monumental. Ruth hugged me tightly. You did it, she whispered. Not yet, I said. But I've finally been heard. A few days later, an envelope arrived. No legal seal this time. Just plain white paper, handwriting I recognized immediately, Daniel's. Anna. Mum's not well. The stress has taken a toll. I don't know how much time she has left, and I don't know if you care anymore, but she asked to see you. She said there's something you should know. If you can find it in your heart, come. I sat there, holding that letter, feeling the old conflict rise again, duty and dignity wrestling inside me. Ruth watched me quietly. You don't owe them anything, she said. I know, I whispered. But maybe I owe myself closure. The Collinses' new house was smaller, plainer, stripped of the grandeur that once surrounded them. When I arrived, Robert met me at the door. His face was drawn, his voice thin. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "She's in the sitting room." Margaret was seated by the window, wrapped in a shawl, her complexion pale. The woman who once commanded every room now looked fragile, breakable. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then she spoke. "You were right." I blinked. "About what?" "About trust. About fairness." I wanted to protect what was mine so badly that I forgot what wasn't. Her voice trembled. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want to give you something." She gestured toward a drawer by her chair. Inside was an envelope. I opened it, a signed legal amendment to the family trust. It listed me as a beneficiary in equal share. I looked up at her, stunned. "Why now?" She smiled weakly. "Because you earned what I only inherited." When I left that day, I didn't feel victory. I felt peace. Margaret died 2 weeks later. The amendment stood, Robert honored it, quietly, without protest. At the memorial, people whispered again, as they always did. But this time, their words didn't touch me. Because I'd stopped living by their version of the story. Months later, I stood outside a small cottage I'd bought with the settlement funds and a loan from Ruth. The paint smelled fresh, the windows gleamed, and the front garden waited for life. I planted rosemary first. Then lavender. Then a small rosebush. Because no matter how many times they bury you, you can always bloom again. There's a strange kind of silence that follows a storm, not peace, but exhaustion. After months of depositions, paperwork, and quiet defiance, I had stopped waiting for vindication. All I wanted now was air. The case was officially closed for deliberation, and all that was left was waiting. Days felt long. Nights longer. But in the spaces between anxiety and relief, something unexpected began to happen. People started to talk differently. Not everyone saw me as the villain anymore. It began small, a few colleagues offering kind smiles in the staff room, a neighbor leaving fresh bread on Ruth's doorstep. Then came the whispers, but softer this time, tinted with curiosity rather than contempt. I overheard one at the grocery store. "You know, she's right. They did her wrong. Can't believe they thought she'd stay quiet." In small towns, narratives have gravity. Once they start shifting, they pull others along with them. When the local paper published a brief note about the family property dispute resolved in favor of equitable review, it wasn't front-page news, but it was enough. People stopped looking at me like I'd broken something sacred. Now, they looked at me like someone who had survived a storm they didn't know how to name. Daniel and I were still separated. We spoke occasionally, always polite, always distant. He'd moved closer to his father to help with arrangements after Margaret's passing. I knew it wasn't easy for him. But every conversation felt like a negotiation with ghosts. One evening, he called. "The verdict's coming this week," he said quietly. My breath caught. "Already?" "Yes." We fell silent for a moment. Then he added, "Mum, she left a letter for you." I froze. "A letter?" "She said she wanted you to have it after everything was settled. I'll drop it off when it's time." Something in his tone, gentler, tired, told me this wasn't just closure. It was confession. The courtroom was small, almost intimate. Just a handful of people, Helen, me, Daniel, and Robert sitting 2 rows behind. The judge entered, papers in hand, voice steady. After reviewing the evidence and contributions presented, he began, "This court finds sufficient grounds to recognize Mrs. Anna Collins's equitable interest in the property previously held under the Collins Family Trust." My heart stopped. Restitution is ordered for her documented financial contributions with additional compensation for breach of implied agreement. Furthermore, all relevant documents will be amended to reflect her acknowledgement as a contributing partner to the estate. The gavel struck, not loud, but final. I sat there, motionless. Not triumphant. Not vengeful. Just free. Helen squeezed my hand. You did it. But all I could manage to whisper was, no. We told the truth. The next days felt surreal. I returned to work, to teaching, to the ordinary rhythm of mornings that no longer hurt. My students' laughter filled the classroom again. I found myself smiling at their little dramas, the spilled juice boxes, the paper airplanes that always seemed to find my hair. At lunch, Miriam approached me. You look lighter, she said. I feel lighter, I admitted. Because for the first time in years, my story wasn't being held hostage by someone else's version of it. A week later, Daniel came by. He didn't knock this time, he just stood at the gate, holding a brown envelope. From Mum, he said softly. I took it, but before he left, I asked, how are you? He gave a half smile. Trying to be someone I should have been sooner. Then he walked away. I stood there for a long time before I opened the letter. Inside, Margaret's handwriting elegant, firm even in its frailty. Anna. When you first came into this family, I admired you. You were gentle, thoughtful, too trusting for a world that rewards cunning. I wanted to toughen you, not realizing I was turning you into someone you'd have to defend yourself against. I wanted control. You wanted peace. I thought control was safer. Now I see, peace is braver. Whatever comes of this, I hope you plant something that's truly yours. Something that grows without permission. Margaret. The paper blurred as tears welled up. Not for her forgiveness, but for the truth in her final line. A few months later, I was invited to a local women's meeting at the library. They asked if I'd speak about community resilience. I almost said no. But then I thought about Margaret's letter, plant something that's truly yours. Maybe this was it. When I stood at the podium, the room was quiet. Mostly women my age and older, faces that had seen their own share of silence. I was raised to believe that good women endure, I began. That we hold families together no matter what, even when they pull us apart. But endurance without voice isn't strength. It's slow disappearance. I paused, scanning the room. Some nodded. Some wiped their eyes. I didn't fight for money, I continued softly. I fought for memory. For the record that says, yes, she mattered here. And if you've ever been written out of your own story, by family, by circumstance, by fear, please know this. You can write yourself back in. When I finished, there was silence, the kind that's heavier than applause. Then, one by one, they began to clap. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough. Afterward, Ruth hugged me outside the library. You sounded like Mum, she said. I smiled. That's the nicest thing anyone's said all year. She tilted her head. So what will you do now? I thought for a moment. Maybe buy a little place. Start over. Quietly this time. She grinned. You. Quiet. Not likely. We laughed, the kind of laugh that unknots years of tension. A month later, Robert came to see me. He looked smaller somehow, grief had a way of hollowing him out. I won't stay long, he said softly, stepping into the garden. The rosemary bushes were blooming, their scent faint but persistent. I wanted to tell you that Margaret's letter meant something, he continued. She wanted to make it right. I know, I said. And she did, in her own way. He looked around at the flowers, the soft light on the leaves. You made this place beautiful. It's mine, I said gently. That's what makes it beautiful. He nodded. I'm glad you fought. She would have wanted you to. As he left, he paused at the gate. You changed her, you know. And me, maybe. I smiled faintly. Sometimes we're meant to break patterns, not inherit them. In the months that followed, I built a new rhythm. I taught, gardened, took evening walks by the river. I no longer flinched when people said my name. It had stopped carrying the echo of someone else's story. The settlement funds helped, but peace wasn't something you could buy. It came in small, ordinary moments, a cup of tea at sunrise, fresh sheets, laughter over dinner with Ruth's family. Every now and then, I'd drive past the old house on Rosewood Lane. It looked the same paint, same veranda, same roses. But it no longer hurt. Because I realized the home I'd lost wasn't walls and windows. It was belonging, and I'd finally found that within myself. In the months that followed, I built a new rhythm. I taught, gardened, took evening walks by the river. I no longer flinched when people said my name. It had stopped carrying the echo of someone else's story. The settlement funds helped, but peace wasn't something you could buy. It came in small, ordinary moments: a cup of tea at sunrise, fresh sheets, laughter over dinner with Ruth's family. Every now and then, I'd drive past the old house on Rosewood Lane. It looked the same paint, same veranda, same roses. But it no longer hurt. Because I realized the home I'd lost wasn't walls and windows. It was belonging, and I'd finally found that within myself. It was late summer when Daniel visited again. He looked different, steadier, older somehow. He stood in the garden, hands in his pockets. "You've done well," he said softly. I nodded. I had to. He hesitated. "I never stopped caring, Anna. I just didn't know how to choose between peace and loyalty." I looked at him for a long time. "Peace doesn't ask for loyalty, Daniel. It just asks for honesty." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry I learned that too late." We talked until the sun dipped low, casting gold light across the garden. There was no promise of reconciliation, no fairytale ending, just mutual understanding. And maybe that was enough. That night, I sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the fields. The house creaked softly, alive, settling into the quiet like it belonged. I whispered, almost to myself, "You kept your promise, Mum. I found home, just not the way I expected." The lavender outside swayed gently in the breeze, filling the room with its calm scent. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. By autumn, the story had faded from gossip and turned into something else, a quiet kind of legend. People still mentioned it now and then, but the tone had changed. It wasn't scandal anymore, it was example. The town that once whispered about me with raised eyebrows now spoke in softer, almost admiring tones. They'd seen me stand alone in the storm and somehow remain kind. At the farmer's market, the bakery woman, the same one who once avoided my gaze, handed me an extra croissant one morning with a smile. "No charge," she said, "for someone who reminded the rest of us to speak up." It's strange how vindication doesn't come with applause. It comes with small gestures like that, quiet acknowledgments that the world saw what you endured, even if it came too late. The new school term began in late September. Children filled the corridors again, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music. Teaching had always been my refuge, the one place where logic met compassion, where everything unfair in adult life found its antidote in innocence. One afternoon, after class, I was erasing the whiteboard when Lucy, the little girl who'd drawn me that house, lingered by the door. "Miss Collins?" she asked shyly. "Yes, sweetheart." She fidgeted with her sleeve. "Mum says when people take your kindness for granted, you can either fight them or forgive them." "Which one did you do?" I smiled, setting down the marker. "Both, I think. First I fought, then I forgave. Fighting makes people hear you. Forgiving helps you hear yourself again." She nodded, thoughtful in that way only children can be. "That sounds hard." "It was," I said softly. "But it was worth it." When she left, I stood there staring at the empty board, the faint ghost of old lessons still visible in the chalk dust: truth, fairness, courage. Maybe those were the only lessons that mattered in the end. That winter, the local community center reached out. They were hosting a panel called Women and Ownership, Voices That Built Homes, and they wanted me to speak. The title made me smile, not because I felt qualified, but because it sounded like something my mother would have attended with pride. When I arrived, the hall smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. About 50 people sat scattered across the rows, mostly women, a few men, some familiar faces, some not. The moderator introduced me as a teacher, advocate, and woman of quiet resilience. The words felt surreal. Just a year ago, I'd been branded ungrateful. I stood at the podium, my notes trembling slightly in my hands. I used to think home meant walls and safety, I began. But now I know it means truth, the kind you build even when no one believes you. I told them about the house, the betrayal, the legal fight, the letter from Margaret, the rosemary I'd planted. But I told it not with anger, but reflection, like a story I'd finally finished reading. When I was done, the applause wasn't loud, but it was long. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just rebuilt my life. I'd rebuilt my voice. A few months later, I started a small community initiative called the Rosemary Project. It offered guidance for women navigating inheritance disputes, financial deception, or property loss, all the quiet injustices that rarely made headlines but left scars just as deep. It began small, a Facebook group, then monthly workshops at the library. Within months, letters started arriving from neighboring towns. Women shared stories of houses signed away, savings misused, promises broken. I listened to every one. Because I knew the sound of disbelief in a woman's voice when she first realizes her trust has been traded for convenience. The project wasn't about revenge or restitution. It was about reclaiming dignity. Because sometimes, all a woman needs is one person to tell her she isn't crazy for wanting fairness. One evening, Ruth visited with a bottle of red wine and a grin. "You're in the paper," she said, waving it like a trophy. I laughed. Again. This time, it wasn't scandal. It was celebration. The headline read, "Local teacher launches Rosemary Project to help women reclaim what's theirs." Underneath was a photo of me at the library, smiling awkwardly, hair slightly windblown, holding a stack of papers. Ruth poured the wine. "You know, Mum would have loved this." I smiled. She would have joined it. We clinked glasses. The clatter was soft, but the meaning heavy, a toast to surviving, to rebuilding, to doing more than just living. Not long after, I received another envelope in Daniel's handwriting. "Anna, I've been thinking about everything, not just the house, but the years before it. You were right. I spent too long trying to keep peace that wasn't real. I let silence become my language. Mum's death, it changed things. I see now how much she loved you, in her own complicated way. She told me once that you were the only one who ever challenged her because you cared enough to risk being disliked. I'm selling my share of what's left. It never meant much without you. Use it for the project. Make something good from what we broke. Daniel." I reread it 3 times, my heart twisting between grief and gratitude. The next week, a transfer appeared in my account, enough to fund the Rosemary Project for another year. For the first time, Daniel had given me something without strings. A few days later, I visited the cemetery where Margaret was buried. The grass was damp with early morning dew. Her headstone was simple, "Beloved wife and mother." I crouched down, brushing a few fallen leaves away. "I got your letter," I whispered. "And your lesson." From my pocket, I took a small cutting of rosemary and planted it by the edge of the stone. "It means remembrance," I said softly. "For you, for what we learned, for what we lost." The wind stirred gently through the trees, a sound like pages turning. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or sadness. Just peace. Weeks later, Robert invited me for tea. He lived alone now, in a quiet flat overlooking the river. When I arrived, he was sitting by the window, looking older, smaller somehow. "Thank you for coming," he said. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunlight shimmer on the water. Finally, he spoke. "She was right about you, you know." "About what?" I asked. "You're the one who remembered what mattered when the rest of us forgot." He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo, the 4 of us standing in front of the old house years ago, laughing. Behind it, a note in Margaret's handwriting. "Family isn't blood. It's truth shared and forgiven." I folded it carefully. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. You gave us back our conscience, Anna. I hope you forgive us. I already did, I said. That's how I survived. It was Helen, my solicitor, who first suggested I write it all down. People need to hear this story, she said. Not the legal version, the human one. So I did. I wrote at night, by lamplight, the scent of rosemary drifting in through the open window. It wasn't a memoir, not exactly. More a letter to anyone who's ever felt erased. I titled it The House Within the House. It became something of a small phenomenon, shared online, read at women's circles, passed quietly between friends. Every email I received afterward began the same way. I thought I was the only one. That, more than anything, felt like justice. One spring evening, as I walked home from the library, I passed the old rosewood lane again. The house stood under a dusky sky, its windows glowing softly. A young couple sat on the porch, a baby sleeping in a bassinet beside them. They looked peaceful, the kind of peace I used to imagine in that very spot. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sorrow, not envy, just the tender ache of remembering what almost was. Then, as I turned to leave, the woman looked up and smiled at me. "Lovely evening," she called. "It is," I said, meaning it. "You have a beautiful home." "Thank you," she said brightly. "We're making it ours, bit by bit." I smiled. That's the best way. And as I walked away, I realized I wasn't walking from the past anymore. I was walking through it, toward something new. That night, I sat at my desk and began a letter I'd never send. Dear Mum. You were right. Home isn't what we inherit, it's what we protect. And dignity isn't given. It's chosen. They sold the house, but they couldn't sell what you taught me. That truth, once planted, grows back no matter how many times it's cut down. I think you'd be proud of me. I hope I've carried your strength the way you carried mine before I ever knew I'd need it. Love, Anna. I sealed it and placed it in the drawer beside Margaret's old letter. Different women. Same lesson. That weekend, I hosted a small garden gathering for the women from the Rosemary Project. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting everything gold. We sat among the lavender and rosemary, sipping tea, sharing stories that didn't need to be hidden anymore. As laughter filled the air, I thought about how strange and beautiful life can be, how sometimes, you lose everything that defined you, only to find who you were meant to be underneath it all. And maybe that's what real inheritance is, not money, not houses, but courage passed on quietly, woman to woman, truth to truth. By the following summer, my life had settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around loss. Mornings began with sunlight spilling through my kitchen window and the sound of sparrows building nests in the eaves. I brewed my coffee, watered the plants, and opened the windows to let the scent of rosemary drift in, that small, constant reminder that healing doesn't arrive with fanfare. It grows slowly, almost invisibly, in ordinary days. Sometimes, I still thought about the old house, the one I'd shared with Daniel and his parents, but the memories no longer came with pain. They came like old photographs, faded, softened at the edges. I had stopped trying to erase what happened. I'd learned instead to live with it, to weave it into something meaningful. Because life doesn't return what you lose, it transforms it into something you can use to build again. That year, my garden became my sanctuary. It started as a simple hobby, a few herbs, some flowers, a small bench where I could read in the evenings. But soon it grew into something larger, a living metaphor for everything I'd survived. I planted rosemary in the center, for remembrance. Lavender by the porch, for calm. Roses by the fence, for beauty born from thorns. Neighbors would stop by to ask for cuttings, and I'd give them freely. They grow best when shared, I'd tell them. One day, an older woman I didn't recognize stopped outside the gate. "Are you Anna Collins?" she asked softly. "I am," I said. She smiled. "I just wanted to thank you. My daughter came to one of your meetings at the library. She left her husband last month, he'd been keeping her name off every deed, every account. She said your story gave her the courage." I felt my throat tighten. "How is she doing now?" She's staying with me. Scared, but strong. I nodded. That's how it begins. After she left, I stood in the garden for a long time, letting the moment sink in. Maybe that was the truest legacy of all, not the court verdict or the money, but the quiet ripples of courage that spread outward from one act of truth. By autumn, the Rosemary Project had grown beyond my little town. Letters arrived from all over the country, some from women in their 60s reclaiming homes they'd been excluded from, others from young wives who'd just discovered the fine print of financial betrayal. Each letter carried a piece of my own past, refracted through different lives. I thought I was crazy until I heard your story. You helped me see that silence isn't peace. Because of you, I finally asked for my name to be on the deed. I kept them all in a wooden box on my dresser. Whenever doubt crept into the quiet, familiar voice that whispered, maybe you went too far, maybe you could have stayed quiet, I opened that box and reread a few. It reminded me that the pain had purpose. One rainy evening, I was preparing tea when I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, drenched, holding an umbrella that had clearly lost its battle with the wind. Daniel. He smiled faintly. I was in town. Thought I'd stop by. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. He took off his coat, shaking rainwater onto the floor. I see you're still the tidy one, he said, glancing around the cozy living room. Old habits, I said with a small smile. Tea, please. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising between us like a fragile peace offering. He cleared his throat. I read your book. My heart skipped. You did. He nodded. Every word. There was a long silence before he added, it was honest. Painful, but fair. You didn't make me the villain. I looked at him gently. You weren't the villain, Daniel. You were just afraid. And fear makes good people do nothing, which can be worse than cruelty. He nodded, eyes glistening. I'm sorry for being a coward. I reached for his hand, just for a moment. You weren't a coward forever. You helped fund the project. That's courage. He smiled weakly. Maybe it's penance. Maybe it's both. We didn't talk about reconciliation, or lost years. We didn't need to. Sometimes love changes form, from passion to peace, from marriage to mutual respect. When he left that night, I walked him to the door. As he stood on the porch, the rain easing to a mist, he said softly, You were always the heart of that house, Anna. I just didn't see it soon enough. I smiled. That's all right. I built a new one. He nodded, smiled faintly, and walked into the night. By winter, people no longer remembered me as the woman who sued her in-laws. They remembered me as the woman who started the Rosemary Project. Sometimes I'd hear strangers mention it in passing. You know that teacher who stood up to her family? She runs that group that helps women now. The tone was different, not pity, not scandal, but respect. And that, to me, was the true healing. Not that the world changed, but that it learned to look at me without flinching. It was a Sunday afternoon in early spring when I finally returned to Rosewood Lane one last time. Not to reclaim, not to grieve, just to see. The young couple who'd bought it were outside, repainting the fence. The woman recognized me immediately. You're the teacher, right? Mrs. Collins. I smiled. Just Anna now. She grinned. It's such a beautiful place. You can tell it's been loved. I nodded. It was. And it still is. She hesitated, then asked, Would you like to see inside? For a moment, my heart trembled, part nostalgia, part hesitation. Then I nodded. Yes, I would. Inside, the house looked different, brighter, more open. The heavy drapes were gone, replaced by light curtains that let the sun pour in. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and paint. The living room was filled with children's toys. I ran my hand over the banister, the same smooth wood Daniel and I had once polished together on a quiet Sunday morning. It's funny, the woman said, smiling. We found your old initials carved under the stair rail A+D. I almost painted over it, but something stopped me. It felt like the house wanted to keep it. I laughed softly. Maybe it did. When I left, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some stories don't need to be rewritten, they just need to be released. That summer, the town council honored the Rosemary Project with a small award for community empowerment and women's advocacy. The ceremony was simple: folding chairs, a borrowed podium, and a banner printed slightly crooked. But to me, it felt monumental. When my name was called, I walked up to the stage, heart pounding. Ruth was in the front row, tears in her eyes. I took a breath and spoke. When they sold the house I thought was my home, I believed I'd lost everything. But what I really lost was my illusion that goodness protects you from betrayal. It doesn't. But it gives you the strength to rebuild afterward. I looked around the room, faces of women, men, students, neighbors. If you've ever been told to stay silent for the sake of peace, remember this: peace without truth is just another form of prison. And sometimes, the only way to rebuild is to start from the ashes, not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. The applause that followed wasn't loud or frenzied. It was steady, warm, like rain on a roof. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen, not for what I'd endured, but for what I'd become. Later that night, after the ceremony, Ruth and I sat on the porch of my cottage with tea and slices of lemon cake. The night was calm, the crickets humming softly. "I never told you this," Ruth said suddenly, "but when you first started the case, I thought you were wrong." I turned to her, surprised. "I thought it was better to keep the peace," she continued. "I thought we'd lose everyone if you spoke up. But you didn't just save yourself, Anna. You saved us too. You showed me that silence isn't loyalty. It's fear dressed as love." I smiled faintly. "We were all afraid, Ruth. But we learned." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Mum would have been proud. Not of the fight, but of what you did after it." We sat there for a while, listening to the wind move through the rosemary. And I thought maybe that's how healing really works. Not as a sudden light, but as a slow, steady dawn that shows you everything you couldn't see before. One morning, months later, I stood at the edge of my garden, watching the sunlight dance across the flowers. For the first time in years, I realized I no longer carried bitterness. The house, the betrayal, the loss, they'd all become chapters, not wounds. And that's when I understood the truest form of healing, when the story stops hurting to tell. That evening, I lit a candle by the window and whispered, "You were right, Mum. You always were. They can sell the roof, but they can't sell the roots." The flame flickered gently, and the room glowed warm. Outside, the rosemary shimmered in the breeze, living proof that something once broken can grow back stronger, fragrant, and full of life. When I look back now, it doesn't feel like a story of loss anymore. It feels like a story of finding not what was taken, but what was waiting underneath. For so long, I thought strength meant silence. That being good meant being agreeable, forgiving before anyone asked, carrying the weight so others didn't have to. But I've learned something I wish I'd known sooner: silence isn't peace. It's permission, the kind that allows wrong things to keep happening, wrapped in politeness. Sometimes, you have to break the quiet to hear your own life again. A few weeks after the ceremony, I received one last letter, no return address, but familiar handwriting. It was from Elaine, Daniel's sister. We hadn't spoken since the court case. "Anna, I don't know if you'll read this, but I owe you an apology. When you started asking questions, I thought you were tearing the family apart. Now I see you were the only one trying to hold it together, just with truth instead of lies. I'm donating part of my inheritance to the Rosemary Project. It's the least I can do to make sure other women don't end up like we did, hiding behind family while fairness dies in silence. Thank you for forcing me to see what we became. You were never against us. You were just for justice." I sat there with that letter in my lap for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. It wasn't vindication that moved me. It was the quiet acknowledgement, the kind that arrives long after the noise fades, when people finally see you clearly. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't an event. It's a process, one that starts when anger no longer feels like protection. That evening, I opened the wooden chest in my living room, the one filled with documents, letters, old photographs, and the worn leather notebook my mother once kept. Her handwriting still carried the same steady grace it always had. Neat, deliberate, every number aligned as though fairness could be measured if you just wrote it carefully enough. That ledger had started everything, the investigation, the confrontation, the reckoning. But now, looking at it, I saw something else. It wasn't just a record of transactions. It was a record of love, quiet, meticulous, unthanked love. My mother never asked to be remembered. She just wanted things to be fair. And maybe that's what all of us want, really, not wealth or recognition, but fairness. To leave behind something honest enough that others can stand on it without falling. A few months later, one of my former students, Lucy, the girl who'd once drawn me that little house, stopped by. She was older now, studying architecture at university. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a sketch, a cottage surrounded by rosemary, lavender, and roses. Below it, she'd written in careful cursive. Design inspired by Miss Collins's garden, the house that truth built. I laughed softly, holding back tears. It was simple, beautiful, and full of meaning. "You made this?" I asked. She nodded proudly. "We had to design a home that represented courage. I thought of you." I hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Lucy. That means more than you know." When she left, I pinned the sketch on my wall beside my mother's old ledger. Different hands, same spirit. That's how legacies really work, passed quietly, not through blood, but through influence. One crisp autumn morning, I packed a small basket, drove out to the edge of town, and stopped by the riverbank, the same one that ran behind Rosewood Lane. The water shimmered with early sunlight. I sat on the grass, closed my eyes, and listened to birdsong, to wind through reeds, to the hum of a life no longer waiting for anyone's permission. I took my mother's ledger out of the basket and opened to the first page. At the bottom, I wrote one final line. Fairness restored. Memory kept. Then I closed it gently and placed it back in the basket. For a moment, I just sat there, tracing the grain of the leather. Then I stood, took a breath, and whispered, "You can rest now, Mum. We both can." The wind picked up slightly, rippling through the reeds. And in that sound, I felt something release, the last tether of anger, guilt, and grief. Not everything lost needs to be found again. Some things need to be let go, so they can return as peace. If I had to put it all into one truth, it would be this. You can't stop people from betraying you, but you can choose not to betray yourself in return. That's what my story became, not about vengeance, but reclamation. Reclaiming dignity, agency, voice. Because when they sold that house, they thought they'd erased me. But what they really did was free me from the illusion that belonging is given. Belonging is built. And sometimes, it takes losing everything you thought was secure to learn what was sacred. Years later, when the Rosemary Project became a registered foundation, I stood on a small stage in a town hall packed with women, teachers, mothers, grandmothers, daughters. They were clapping, smiling, some crying quietly. I wasn't nervous. I'd stopped being nervous about truth long ago. When the applause died down, I said, "This isn't my story anymore. It's ours. Every woman who's ever been told to let it go, you belong here. Every person who's been made to feel small for asking for fairness, this is for you." And then, I looked at the crowd and said softly, "They buried me alive in silence once. But I dug up my own truth and it bloomed." The room erupted in applause, but I wasn't thinking about the sound. I was thinking about my mother, about Margaret, about Ruth, about Daniel, and about every woman who ever planted something out of pain and watched it grow anyway. That night, after the event, I walked home under a sky full of stars. The air was cool, the roads quiet. In the distance, My little cottage glowed with warm yellow light. I paused outside the gate, just watching for a moment. There was the rosemary, brushing softly in the wind. The same scent, the same symbol, remembrance and rebirth. I thought of Margaret's final letter, of Daniel's apology, of Elaine's donation, of my students' laughter, of Ruth's pride. All of it, the pain, the justice, the forgiveness, folded together like pages of a book that had finally closed. And in that stillness, I whispered a truth I wish every woman could know. You don't have to burn yourself to keep a false peace warm. Peace built on silence collapses. But peace built on truth, that kind lasts. When I first told this story, I didn't think anyone would understand. But now I know there are thousands of us, all carrying our own ledgers. Not of numbers, but of memories, moments when we were shortchanged, unseen, or told that our pain wasn't worth recording. If that's you, I want you to know, it matters. Your story matters. Even if they call you difficult, disloyal, or dramatic, tell it anyway. Because silence never protects the right people. Sometimes, speaking up costs you your home. But keeping quiet costs you your soul. So build your own house, not of bricks, but of truth. One word, one act of courage at a time. And when they ask how you found the strength, tell them the same thing I learned standing in court, standing in my garden, standing in my own truth. I stopped asking for a place to belong. I built one. I suppose that's what I've learned, after everything. You can rebuild walls. You can repair roofs. But trust that you have to grow again, from the ground up. Would you have done what I did? Would you have fought for fairness even if it meant losing the home you thought was yours? Tell me in the comments. And remember, sometimes the things we lose aren't punishments. They're invitations to finally come home to ourselves.